fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. On KC 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren, and there's Mr. Dave Martino.
Hello.
Just got back from the karate workout.
That's right. Always. Always out there causing trouble, Al.
Yeah, you do it out in the street. I'll tell you, I'd call the police.
Yeah, they usually do.
I'd say there's some weird man out there with swords and running around kicking and doing all this stuff, and I don't know what's going on.
I can run fast, though, so I've never been caught yet.
Well, I'll give him the address next time. How's that? You know, where he's located.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he has a whole basement full of weapons.
Yes.
Yeah.
Basement of the House of Mystery.
Yeah, basement full of weapons. Twinkies.
Twinkies, yes.
Twinkies. Well, okay, let's get on to this now. This is, we've got a short story writer, so it's kind of like, you should be kind of in this league, too. You do that sort of thing. You know, so. He's been in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine several times, and he's got quite a history. Let's just get him in and see what's going on in his world. So, Mr. David Dean, thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Alan, Dave, for having me. I'm really glad to be here. I appreciate it.
Well, hopefully you say that at the end of the show. I know
Me too.
Yeah, it doesn't always go that way. But so what is going on here now? It looks like in my quick view over who you are and everything, you're kind of a mystery noir writer, short story. It's kind of what I'll say short, quickly. Is that a good description of who you are, or how do you describe yourself as a writer?
Well, it's I'm primarily, I guess, if primarily a crime fiction, not just noir, but have a couple of different subgenres, I guess, I work in crime fiction, as well as I also write horror stories from time to time, not nearly as frequently, but I've been hacking away at it for over 30 years now. And,
Gee, that's pretty good. You're only 35.
Yeah, I was about 30 years ago.
Well, and horror and crime kind of can cross over at times, right? Like you could really mix the two pretty easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I did that several times with Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, and they kind of aided and abetted me in that. There's an element, it doesn't necessarily solve the mystery or whatever, but there's an element of the supernatural involved in a story. And of course, in almost every horror story, if you think about it, in most horror stories, I will say, there is a crime of some sort.
Right.
So they kind of...
Sometimes it's a story.
Yeah, sometimes it's a story. Yes. But it's so they do kind of mix, I think, pretty easily, but the audiences, the reading audiences, do not mix that well. You don't have, at least this has been my understanding, you don't have a lot of people who are real, for instance, horror fans that necessarily read much mystery, and then it's, vice versa. A lot of mystery readers are like, no, don't go to horror. So it's kind of interesting that way. But I do see crossover stories fairly frequently in the written.
Yeah, I think some of the horror writers, or readers, I should say, are probably more into a lot more intense suspense or gore sometimes. Mm-hmm. It's got to be a lot more violent, right? Noir and sometimes even crime fiction quite a bit isn't so violent, I would say.
Yeah, not necessarily. It's, you can have, what I term a pretty quiet crime fiction, that's mostly psychological, where you're in the heads of either the perpetrator or perhaps the the investigator, be they police or civilian, and or sometimes even the victim, so that it can actually be very quiet. The crime itself may have happened years before. I know one story I wrote called Tomorrow's Dead, which is the titular story for the collection, Tomorrow's Dead, and other stories of crime and suspense. That was actually, there are violent crimes within that one, so it's probably not a great example, but it's actually, most of the story is based on a crime that had happened, or several crimes that had happened decades before, completely off screen, so to speak. And then as the story unravels, we find out about that at the end and realize that's what's propelling the current rash of crimes, of murders that are being committed.
No, when you do a short story like that too, how much of a characters can you really get into or describe in a short story? Like, how is it you do it so that, let's say, a reader will understand the characters in such a short way? I don't know how to say this, but how is it that I'm going to understand who these characters are without getting into pages and pages of details?
Well, and that is the challenge of writing short stories. It really is. Typically, they're not character-driven. However, you bring up a really good point, which is you have to have good characters nonetheless. So brevity, of course, is what you have to go for. And usually, you can suggest it, with just a few lines, maybe through the character's own observations, you learn something about his character or her character. And depending on how the story is being told, maybe from others, a couple of lines that give an idea about who the person is. But unlike a novel, as you're pointing out, I think that you don't get pages in which to describe both physically or in any other way any of the characters. You just get a few lines or paragraph at most and move on. So you really have to be very succinct, very specific, and then move on. I believe in letting the reader fill in a lot. I mean, once you've given them something to go on, I give readers credit for a lot of intelligence, and they'll usually fill in the rest without any problem.
Well, speaking of your characters, do you have an inner monologue? Can you hear your characters? Is that kind, and can you hear the prose? Is that kind of how you create fiction, or do you have another way? Are you more visual?
Typically, I think I'm more visual to begin with, at least. Sort of kickstarts with that, with an image or images, and a setting usually. And then I start to people it, kind of like doing a landscape, and then you start putting characters on the landscape. As far as the dialogues, sometimes, they'll speak to me. A lot of writers say that that's how they work, but I can't say that in general that that's the case. Usually it's when I sit down to write, when I'm actually in the act of writing, the dialogue starts to come to me, what they would say or wouldn't say. And part of that is, I should preface this by saying that, going back to about the question about portraying characters, or painting characters in words, is that usually before I write a story, I also do a little sketch of my own. I mean, not a drawing, because I can't draw anything but stick figures, but like a paragraph or two, and sometimes a whole page describing in detail a character. Now, all of that won't end up in the story, because it's a short story, but out of that, I'll be able to draft certain things that will help build that character. And then from that, having a sort of a solid foundation, usually the dialogue ends up not being a big problem.
Right. Now, of course, your Wisdom of Serpents and Tomorrow's Dead, they're two collections, and they're kind of based on short stories of crime and suspense, as you call it. Where do you get that from? Is this like your time in prison, or were you like where does this come from? Were you sort of influenced by shows like Perry Mason or something like that?
Well, I did spend 25 years as a police officer.
Okay, so
And here in New Jersey. So some of it is, informed by that. Like the first book, Tomorrow's Dead, is all about law enforcement officers or people involved in law enforcement in one capacity or another. There's a police officer, there's a police chief, there's a detective, there's a dispatcher, each of them in various stories. Whereas the second collection also deals with crime and stuff, but it's more about people who are not involved in law enforcement normally, and they're just kind of stumbling along through life like most of us, and they make a really bad choice based on either their misunderstanding of something or just making a bad decision. And then about the consequences of all that, which is the wisdom of serpents. That's what that's about. The wisdom of serpents being poison, basically. And sometimes, we poison ourselves without realizing it and get into a lot of trouble and then have to figure out some way out of it. So there's that. You mentioned prison. I've never spent any time in prison. I did spend a night in jail once when I was a teenager. Convinced me I did not want to go any further in the criminal world. It's done with that. However, I did have I had an uncle. He's since passed away many years ago. I had an uncle who I pretty much grew up with he was a career criminal. He was a bank robber, did time for murder, did a lot of things, a lot of unpleasant things. So I did know him pretty well. I mean, he basically lived with us sometimes when in between stays in prison. Got to know him and got to know something about basically, not to speak ill of the dead, but I mean, how criminals think.
yeah.
He was an interesting character, and he liked to talk. I mean, he would tell us a lot of inappropriate things for kids to know.
Well, and is there a concept behind it? Like, do you have kind of like when you decide to write, 10 or 12 short stories, let's say in the first one, Tomorrow's Dead, and it's kind of police procedural and stuff, do you choose them from sort of procedures that you think people maybe are interested in, or maybe they don't understand or something? Like, do you have a concept when you choose the topics?
Well, both of these collections were, sort of gathered together, in most cases, quite a while after they were originally published. I think when I was writing, I started off writing when I was still a police officer, and I started off writing about a police officer. Surprise. Just a patrolman, sort of everything from the street level, just simple stories, and based on either things that calls, the type of calls I'd been on, or some of my partners had been on. From that, I would weave a fictional tale. As time went by, I mean that grew into basically segueing over into not just the police, but other characters as well. So I can't say that I had an agenda, if you will. I really didn't. It just, things would suggest themselves to me. It'd pop up in my mind, or, I just, like I said, I'd get an image or a picture in my head of something, and I'd say, well, that might work for a story. And usually I'd outline. I'm one of those, I'm not a by the seat of the pants person too much. And so I outline, and then if I know if I can get to the end of the outline, if I can have a beginning, middle, and end, even if that's not what I end up writing, I feel like I can do the story, that this can be a story. And sometimes it ends up very differently from the outline, but it gives me the comfort level to say, you can do this. You'll end up not just wasting your time.
Well, how much literary license do you take with police procedure, or can you? Do the readers take you to task if you veer from the truth to serve the plot?
I've not had any do that yet, but I try to, in terms of police procedures, and of course now I'm becoming less of an authority on police procedures and more of a historian, because I've been retired for 10 years, and things have changed a lot, and in police work, it's changed a lot technologically, right, too. So in a very short amount of time. and was doing so even when I was working. Most everything I wrote was based on my own experiences in terms of police work and based on New Jersey law. Not that they necessarily were set in New Jersey, but that's, New Jersey procedures, New Jersey law. That's what I knew. So I tried to be, assiduous in that. Beyond that, it was all fiction.
So what are your influences besides your work? Like, do you read a lot of mystery and crime, or in a fictional sense, or is this?
Well, actually, yes, I wouldn't say I read a lot of crime fiction. I probably read more history, nonfiction, than that. I've just always been like, that's I guess because I do write, that's my relaxation is reading nonfiction, specifically history. I do, in fact, read like Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, which has a lot of great writers in it, other, than myself, of course. I don't know where they get them from, but somehow or another they managed to put them all together. And my name doesn't even get on the cover.
How rude.
I know.
Come on. I've got seniority here, but it doesn't work.
No, right?
No.
But yeah, so I read that. So I sort of stay current with, and I know actually at this point now, I've been at it so long, I know a lot of the writers. I've met them at one point or another, and which is interesting. And we kind of keep in touch through Zoom and that sort of thing, and talk about writing and the writing scene, especially crime fiction in particular. When I was growing up, I read a lot. I mean, and I still read quite a bit of. When I read fiction, I tend to read horror stories or ghost stories or tales of the supernatural, that kind of thing. When I was growing up, I think I read. I certainly was influenced by Raymond Chandler, because I did read like all the Philip Marlowe novels. I was especially influenced, I think, by a pair of Swedish writers who, I don't know if anybody in America knows them, because it was sort of before a lot of the Swedish mystery writers broke into the American scene and became so popular. But it was a couple who wrote, and I'll murder their names because they're Swedish, but Per Wahlöö and Maj Sjöwall wrote a series of police procedural novels that I read when I was in the Army. And I came across like in a military library in Baumholder, Germany. I read that, and that was like the first time I really thought, wow, this is really interesting. And it may have even been what sparked my interest in police work, to begin with, because it was after I came out of the Army, then I went into police work. They were a big influence on me. They were very meticulous kind of in their, at least, not that I'm an authority on Swedish police work, I'm taking them at their word, but they seem to be very meticulous and careful, and they also wrote great stories. So crime fiction wise, those three writers influenced me quite a bit. There's been a number of writers, I guess, that over the years that have definitely influenced me. From Poe to, I guess he influenced everybody, but he invented the detective story. And of course, if you're going to read horror fiction, it's hard to get around Edgar Allan Poe. Other than that, I guess, it's pretty eclectic, my taste in writing. Everybody from Ray Bradbury to Graham Greene to Joyce Carol Oates, Flannery O'Connor.
Well, you mentioned Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. What was it like the first time that you got into a top magazine like that? I don't write a lot of crime fiction, but I haven't been able to crack that market.
Yeah, my story there is unusual. I'd just gotten back to the States. I'd gotten work, thank God, because I was about to run out of money, and I had a wife and I had a family, and so I'd gotten work, and I graduated the academy, I started going to a local community college. And one of the courses we had to take was a arts appreciation course. It was just kind of your standard thing, and the professor was very good. But in the end, he said, well, you got to do something. You got to create something to show, your appreciation for the arts. You can draw something, you can write something, sculpt something, just give something, take a stab at something. And that was our final. And so I said, okay, well, drawing's out. Pretty much everything's out, because I can't sing. I have no musical abilities whatsoever. Music dies when I enter a room. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write a story, because I had like a year or so behind me now in police work, and I thought about it. I thought maybe I could write a story. So I did that, and it wasn't very long, and it was just like, they always tell you, write what you know. Well, I wrote what I knew, and it was about a patrolman on duty and about catching a burglar, basically. And when I finished, turned it in, the professor said, well, that's really good. He said, that's really good. He said, I think, you should try to get it published, which had not crossed my mind until he brought it up. It just hadn't. And I thought, well, sure, sounds good. Can't hurt. I mean, what could possibly go wrong here? So I submitted to Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, and I can't say that's because I was really familiar with them. I wasn't. I just kind of looked it up and well, this is a mystery magazine. Alfred Hitchcock's a mystery magazine, and there were a couple of others. And I thought, well, I'll start with Ellery Queen, and they bought it, and I was floored. I was I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is crazy. They bought that? They gave me money for this story? They have made a mistake, because once they gave me money, I'm going to keep coming back. So, and then I found out later how fortunate I was, actually, how lucky I was, because people bang on the door there for years.
Yes.
And I get very, frustrated, and I just, stumbled in with my mouth open and everything, and I didn't know how lucky I was. Then I turned around and saw the second story I wrote, and I thought, well, there's no stopping me now. Yes, there was, because the third, the fourth, the fifth, they turned down. And that went on for quite a while, where I would just keep cranking out stories and sending them and keep getting rejection notices. And then finally, I turned the tide again, and I got a story published, and basically with them, and then basically been writing for them for, nearly 30 years. Yeah, 30 years at least.
Well, what do you think makes a good story? What makes a good short story to you?
Well, I think, Poe probably had it right, when, and I'm just going to paraphrase it because I can't remember exactly how he said it or wrote it, but it's basically, it's a good short story. You really should probably be able to read in a sitting, and it deliver an impression or an effect at the end, a punch, something at the end that sticks with you. And everything in the story should basically build up to that moment, that climax. Because I mentioned earlier, it's not, unlike a novel, it's not really going to be character driven. It's going to be more, of what happens in the story is more important. So at the end, there should be a payoff. And that's, I'm sure, not how Edgar Allan Poe said it, but I think I'm right in interpreting it that way. So I think that's what makes a good short story, is that lingering moment at the end, that where you think about it, you go, wow, okay. And it sticks with you for a while.
Who is this Poe guy? I'm going to have to look him up.
He's obscure. A lot of people haven't heard of him. Edgar or something.
Yeah, I keep getting that, and I hear about this Stephen King dude, but I can't find him on Amazon, so
Stephen
I don't.
King, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I've heard he's got some talent, possibility of making something of himself.
Well, they say that about some of the worst. Make him sound better, clean them up, Oh, he may be rough, but he's got potential. Yeah.
I did read a lot of Stephen King for a while when I went through a Stephen King reading period, and but he just outwrote me after a while. My God, he's the most prolific writer on the face of the planet. Him and James Patterson, I think. It's just nonstop.
Drugs.
It's amazing.
Drugs.
It was in the beginning.
Maybe I need to look into that.
This is now we found.
Here we go.
There we go. Next book will be short stories on and you can call yourself Drug Dean.
Well, they say Edgar Allan Poe also. I mean, there's rumors that he fooled around with narcotics of some kind.
Oh, I'm sure.
Well, talking about Poe and King, what draws you to horror? What draws you to want to read that genre?
Well, I think that started actually when I was a kid, and so that's a long time ago. So I'm going to have to really dredge the memories here. But I think I remember at the school library, we had a collection of ghost stories, and I'm sure that they were inappropriate. They probably would not be on the shelves of today's schools. But I think I just picked it out one day and started reading, and was hooked. I can't tell you what the name of the collection was because it was so long ago. It was like when I was in the fourth grade or something. But then I sort of started hunting them up, like Poe, and I remember reading a collection of, they weren't necessarily horror stories, but there were a few of H.H. Munro, Saki, as he was his pen name. Ray Bradbury I got into. He's not really a horror writer, but some of his sci-fi stories were pretty horrific. Yeah, I think it really started just from the school library. They tainted me. I was still in elementary school. And Richard Matheson, who was a prolific short story writer like Ray Bradbury. Now, he wrote a lot of science fiction, but he also wrote a lot of horror and a lot of sort of crossover. Of course, he has the famous novella, I Am Legend, which kind of kicked off the whole zombie thing, even though it was really about a vampire plague. But he wrote a great short story, which talk about having a punch and everything. I think it lingers in the mind. It's a short story, and it's quite brief. It's just, and I believe it's called Born of Man and Woman. And I think that's one of the best horror stories I've ever read.
Do you have a favorite character that you've written?
Well, I guess...
or maybe a favorite story.
In terms of characters, like one of them that stayed with me for a long time was a character I dubbed Father Gregory. Father Gregory is a Catholic priest who comes from India and is the parish priest for the town in which the police character that I had a series of stories about, Julian Hall, so in other words, it's his parish priest. And the reason that I came up with this character was because I knew a priest, had a parish priest who was from India, and he was really a great guy. We got to be close friends, and so I couldn't resist. There was something about him that was so genuine and engaging that he ended up, his character, both in reality that I based it on, but also the character that I created out of that, I think became one of my favorite characters, Father Gregory. I think he's been in quite a few stories, actually. And one of them called In a Dark Manor, and not manor like a manor house, but in a dark manor as in M-A-N-N-E-R. It's one of my favorite stories featuring him, in which, in fact, there's no police officer in it at all. He simply has a woman who comes in for confession, who's not Catholic, but wants to confess to something that happened when she was a girl. Make a long story short, he allows her to do this and affords her the sanctity of the confession so that he cannot repeat what he hears. And she tells him a story. And so I think in some ways that's about this crime that she had committed as a girl, along with several other girls. And it's a murder. And I think that's one of my favorite stories because it starts with him and then you sort of dip into his thinking as she's telling the story from time to time, and then it ends with him as she's leaving. And I think I like that one. Probably the best the Father Gregory stories. Other series characters, I had an Irish-American gangster, Seamus Tyrrell, who I've had in about 5 or 6 stories, maybe 7 by now. Kind of like him because he just gets to, unlike the police officers, always, you have to go by the rules. When you write about criminals, when they're the main character, you don't really have to worry about all that. It's a lot easier. You can have a lot more going on. So I kind of enjoyed writing those. Liberating. Being on the other side.
Well, having written so many short stories, have you found any motifs, any recurrent themes in your work? And if you have, do you think it's been deliberately put in there, or has it been unconscious?
I have, as a matter of fact. I think looking back over my career as a writer, I began to see that there were definite themes. Like if somebody was studying my work, which God forbid they should have to do, but if they did, I think you would definitely see several themes develop. Even I could see it. One of them, interestingly, has to do with nature. Animals come up a lot in some of my stories, and often not in a benevolent way. Like I've had several stories where like the household dog features in the story in some way, not necessarily as the main character, but certainly plays a role. Other things, I think, the conflict, that conflict of conscience that people deal with, not me, of course, as they struggle with issues. The issue, the very, as the theme of the wisdom of serpents, that comes up a lot, which is, I guess, why I have a collection of it, which is people misinterpreting the situation they're in, or seeing it through a prism that is sort of their own making, and not understanding that they're seeing it wrong, all wrong. And their response is only going to make it worse. So that is a definite theme in a lot of my stories. And then, of course, in some cases, they get out of it. In other cases, they don't. More tragic, but...
So you're writing about Americans.
I think probably people in general. But yes, certainly. And also I've written quite a few stories featuring children, that's always a tough subject to write because you have to be very, very careful. You can cross the lines with crime fiction and children very, easily. So there's a delicate balance there. But a couple of, I would say some of my more popular stories were, in fact, about children. One called Marielle came in second place in the Reader's Award for the year it came out, the Ellery Queen Reader's Award. And another called Sophie at third place. Tomorrow's Dead, which actually does not have any children in it, though it's about a crime that happened concerning children in the past, got nominated for an Edgar. Didn't get it, but got nominated. So yeah, I think, children take a beating in crimes. In other words, they are doubly victimized by crimes because they're children. I have a lot of empathy, I guess, for children who are in tough situations in terms of their families being dysfunctional to the extreme. I find that they make very sympathetic protagonists. And sometimes in some of the stories, they're pretty tough because kids can be ruthless. They're not necessarily bound by any laws, anything.
Right. Yeah, just listen to some of Dave's stories. From the 80s there, crazy,
Yeah.
Tell you. But when you're doing this, when you're dealing with people that are, they're seeing something wrong, or they're misinterpreting, as you said, kind of their surroundings and what they're going through. Are you writing? Do you write in first person? Like, do you write from that person's point of view, that person's mind, or are you telling it about them from an outside point of view? How do you write that?
I generally do the third person. I've never been big on first person. Not that I haven't done that. I have. But generally, I'd like third person. It just to me, it's more of a, first of all, it's more of a challenge. Doing first person is, to me, it's easier, but it also boxes you in somewhat, because obviously you can only see through their eyes. The reader, the writer can only write through how they see things, and the reader can only do the same. So I think most of the time I like to write in third person so that I have a bigger scope. And I think it's especially because they are short stories. I want that ability to do as much as I can in the story. But sometimes though, obviously doing first person works great. It's the only way to tell a particular tale. Like the Telltale Heart. It'd be hard to do better than that in terms of first person story. But I don't do a lot of that. I find it's more satisfying to do the third person.
Yeah. Well, I guess you can explain things from an outer perspective of you can explain what your character is getting wrong, I guess, from an outside point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And you can certainly give the reader, at the very least, you can give the reader hints. You can inform them of certain things that the protagonist may be the very things that they're misinterpreting or not seeing. So it's kind of like watching the slow-moving train wreck. You see it coming, but there's just not a lot you can do about it.
You do nothing but describe the train.
Yeah.
So do you ever see yourself writing a full novel or a book or something other than a short story?
Yes, I have done. And I wrote a horror novel called The 13th Child. It's a vampire story, in which the premise is basically built around a vampire that is a product of evolution, one of the last of his kind living amongst us, and is also a child. But he's not, there's nothing supernatural. He is simply an evolutionary product that was, in the dawn of time, created to prey upon us. That's why he looks a lot like us, is able to mimic us, but he's not us. So The 13th Child, I wrote that, and that did pretty well. Didn't threaten Stephen King, but it did okay.
Well, you just got to write it when he takes the day off.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Just the day off. Keep waiting for it.
So you use victims of children. Is that because maybe they're innocents, because they're naive? It's kind of what gives them. Yeah,
yes, yeah, definitely. Like in the story, Marielle, she's, obviously all children are innocent, and until they're, in some way informed by life, corrupted by life.
Yeah, don't forget about Dave.
You can't forget about Dave.
Yeah, totally correct.
He runs around with a sword. I'm not going to forget about it.
Yeah,
but she's actually kind of a force to be reckoned with in this story. In that her mission, she discovers that someone has killed her dog, and upon realizing that, she decides to investigate all of her neighbors to determine who did it and to get retribution in the way that, only a child can do, the kind of naivete, but at the same time, a certain sort of focus and disregard for, the rules and regs. And
right.
So she's kind of a scary Nancy Drew, except she's younger than Nancy.
I thought you were going to say Nancy Grace.
She can be scary too, actually.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, very angry. But So and then in another story, Sophie. Sophie is actually a girl's name, but the main character is a friend of hers, and he's a young boy, and she disappears, and he suspects her parents. Well, actually, it's her mother and her mother's boyfriend, and they run a crack house, basically, and he suspects that something's happened to Sophie, and they're either responsible for it or covering it up, and he investigates. So they're not just in the stories. They're in a lot of these stories. They are on the attack. They are doing as only children can do. They're acting on what they believe completely and absolutely, because the filtering system isn't there.
Oh, do I have a filter?
Well, I may be ascribing you characteristics you don't possess. I don't know, but I know. Well, I'm probably very much like some of my own characters. I probably see things in a way that is often wrong. In fact, I know that, dude, to my sorrow. So yes, children. I think children. It's a tough subject, like I said, because you have to be careful. The readers, obviously, they're not going to like it if anything, really bad happens to a child. To write children characters can be a challenge too, because obviously it's. I know their listeners can't see me, but it's been a while since I was a kid. But I do remember it pretty much.
Last century.
Yeah. Yes, as a matter of fact, last century. Yes. Mid-century modern, I think, is the furniture term. And that would describe me.
Well, so is there any? Do you have a problem writing about the darkness, or is the crux to the story? Is it kind of the what should I say? The movement, the current of the story is more about the fighting or overcoming the evil or the bad thing.
Yeah, I think definitely that. It is. You have your characters, but it is, yes, definitely a fight, a movement towards justice, towards a resolution,
right?
And a good and
solving.
Not necessarily the perfect ending, but some form of justice.
Right. Is this because working in law enforcement, you saw a lot of unsolved justice, perhaps not resolved?
Well, I mean, I certainly saw, a number of dysfunctional families, and I know lots of people who grew up in them, including myself to some degree. And I know how hard it can be on children to be in those situations. It's very tough. I'll give you a story. One time I was on duty, and we got a call, the department, that there were two children walking down the street, a girl and a boy, and it was the middle of the day. They didn't look to be school age, and there was no adult with them. And so I went on the call. I get there, and I find the kids walking down the street on the sidewalk. The little sister, she's holding the little boy. He's younger. He's still in diapers. She's holding his hand. I'm able to determine where they came from because I had dealt with the family in the past. Got them taken care of, and I got a social worker there and everything. And I went back to the house, and I walk up onto the porch, and there's a slider. It was a rental unit. It was on the first floor, and there was a slider. And I looked through the slider, and I see the father, whom I'd met before and dealt with, and he's passed out, and there's nobody else there. So I go in and I wake him up, a little shocked to see me. I ask him, I said, "Where are your kids?" "They're here." ? I could tell it was. He sort of knew I was a loaded question, and I said, "No, they're not." And we went from there. Anyway, he got arrested and for neglect. But this was like a 4-year-old girl and a 2-year-old boy, just left in essence on their own in a household that was, things like that, are sad. They stick with you and, make you realize kids have a tough time of it, it's, or can, and they grow up, and then it all comes out in a wash. But, so I have a lot of sympathy. I guess I have a lot of sympathy for them. I had a lot of, when I was growing up, there was a lot of thick violence in my neighborhood, and a lot of, fathers were pretty tough on their kids, to say the least.
Well, I'm still waiting to meet someone that had one of those families I see on TV, like Leave It to Beaver or something. I didn't know a family like that. So
no,
for me, I kind of thought, well, that was weird. None of the neighbors.
No, the same way. Yeah, I guess it was the models, the role model. But I was the same way. I was like, but I never questioned it. I just thought, well,
They're somewhere.
Yeah, it's not us. It's not our neighborhood. But,
well, if you grew up with a working class dad too, like myself, or they never wore a suit in their life.
Right.
They didn't come home dressed in a suit and a tie, and mother wasn't wearing that lovely dress and necklace when she's prancing around making dinner. That just I didn't see that coming. I had.
Yeah, same here. That was a different world.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, maybe Dave, did you grow up like that?
No, not at all.
Well, see, I still am yet to meet someone.
Yeah, well, I kept thinking we might move to that neighborhood, but we kept hoping we would.
Yeah, that never happens. Well, let's move on to this. Now, do you have a social media set up? Do you interact with readers? Do you have a website? Where do people find you?
Well, you can find me on Genius Books or geniusbookspublishing.com. You see it there. I'm on Goodreads. I have a Facebook. I'm on Facebook. I don't have a website. No excuse. Just don't have one. But I'm in those three places. And all my books and collections are on Amazon and with Genius Book Publishing.
Right.
Who are great, by the way. They're terrific.
They're genius.
Stephen, they are, and they only accept writers of a genius caliber.
Is that what it is?
Well, you can't name a company that if it's not true.
Oh,
so,
that's right.
I think they made a few mistakes, but that's...
You have to prove it.
Not naming names here. Anyway. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Of course, we were talking about your latest features, The Wisdom of Serpents and Tomorrow's Dead, both good series of short stories. And, of course, we're going to have all that up on our website, so people can find it one click. And, what can I say? So thank you very much for being here, Mr. David Dean.
Thank you so much, both of you, for having me. I really do appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, David.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.